Hi friends, host Eric here, host Talking with Famous People, and today I'm here with not host Mark, Kaizo, I think I heard Iced Whiskey in the mix here, maybe some other people. I think Susie might be here, I'm not sure. Anyway, we've got this video that we're going to talk about called Everyday Life Without Free Will with these two morons. So I've critiqued this moron before, the one on the left, and I think I've critiqued both morons before independently. Now I'm critiquing them together. So we've written down a few timestamps to note and talk about. Their basic point here is that determinism, we don't have any free will, and various associated correlates. So let's listen.
It comes from because we feel as though we're acting upon a desire.
Exactly,
so
like you
free,
feel like you pick up a cup, etc.
But free will isn't concerned with the action, it's concerned with the desire itself.
Okay, so right off the bat, let me just say right there at 11:45, free will doesn't have concern. It's a conceptual mode of understanding human existence. It's not something that has its own concern. You're making a reification fallacy. That's just, I didn't even get to the first timestamp and I accidentally stopped there and you're immediately wrong. Immediately wrong. Okay, so let's see, 1315.
In the sense that they battered the bloke in the head with, the father of a family in the head with, I think it was a vase of some sort. They unfortunately raped one of the children. They did basically horrific things. And the point that he's getting to in it is that if you accept this, the thesis of this book, the idea that we don't have free will, then you can't really say that they could have done something else, because
okay, so he's saying right here, for those of you who can't hear it in the room, but he's basically saying, here's an example.
Can't hear anything.
Here's an example of a horrific crime, and in this book, somebody says, well, the problem with determinism is that if we acknowledge determinism, then we can't.
Harris.
Okay, then we cannot argue that they ought to have done something else, because actually they were unable to have ever done anything else. It was predetermined what they were going to do. So that's what the argument is that he's setting up to now purportedly defeat. Let's see what he has to say about it.
The point he makes is that if he had every atom that comprises that individual, he would have acted the same way. That's what the evidence shows.
Yeah, that's exactly what he says, isn't it?
Exactly.
Okay, so if he would have had every atom exactly the same, if he'd have been the exact same individual, he would have acted the same way. If he had been that individual, then he wouldn't be him, he would be that individual. So it's true that if Bob acted as X in situation Y, then it's likely that if we were to be able to repeat time, he'd act in way X in situation Y again. And it's also true that if Bob equaled you, then you would act in situation X with situation Y, or with reaction Y. It's so utterly ridiculous that they can't seem to acknowledge that simply saying, if you violated the law of non-contradiction, then magic. But you can't violate the law of non-contradiction.
But it's a refusal to define what a self or a person is as well, I would say.
The refusal to mean something
what is it to
specific.
say? Right, and then like, what is that specific thing that makes you you? They haven't said. And if it's atoms, well then to say if I was Bob is just googly gook.
I'm not simply atoms, right? I do have a metaphysical component. I have memories, I have self-concept, I have words that I say. I leave time objects like this video out on the internet. So this is part of me, once I set it out there in a way, part of my memories and part of my self-concept. It's not made up of atoms. I mean, sure,
yeah, but,
in some form it is, but...
If your worldview, though, is that everything is composed of simply matter or atoms or whatever, to say that if I was Bob is meaningless, because if it's simply atoms, you can't do that. If this atom was this atom, it loses its meaning. It's like saying, well, if an apple was a banana.
Distinct objects in space have
you can't do that.
Distinct objects in space have the constraint that they must retain their distinction by not being something else at the same time, place, and context. That's the law of non-contradiction.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it makes no sense to say, if you were to say, well, if all the circles were square, then we could build a nice cube out of them easily by stacking. But they're not, circles aren't squares, so it doesn't matter what follows the first half of the conditional. Now note, they're using conditionality in their discussion, but they seem to be unaware of its existence. Conditionality treats time differently, and it's a way of being. It's not a subset of causality, it's a way of being. I can be in multiple ways. I can be by actually causing effects, or I can be by conditionally considering causing effects. So, begin with that, you two. And I know I've been insulting and everything, but to the extent that you ever actually watch the video, which I'm sure you won't, but if you do, try to actually learn something from it. Let's go on. The next timestamp I have is 1815. Determinism is, of course, ridiculous because even if you embrace it and say, okay, yes, I'm going to be determinist about this, it's meaningless in and of itself because it's just what you've been predetermined to say for no reason. And if it's used to justify anything, it falls apart immediately because, after all, there's no intentionality, no truth, no purpose, you're just an automaton. There's no metaphysical component to the self that makes any kind of decisions. It may feel like you're making a decision, but you're not really making any decisions because you have no choice but to do what you were going to do based on what's happened before. The fact that the future necessarily follows from the past doesn't mean it's predetermined.
If you say that determinism is true, you're determined to say that it's true. You're not saying it's true because you understand its truth value. You're just saying it's true because you're determined.
Because you have no choice.
You can't hold knowledge.
Because you're a machine that does that. Having been wound up, you're a machine that does that. Like Mark says here, though, that means that you can't possibly make claims such as, no, this is true and that is false, or because truth and false don't mean anything. They're just illusions that we have for no reason, apparently. We're forced by causes stretching back infinitely far. We're forced by causes to talk as though we believed in this illusion and to believe we believe in this illusion because we've been predetermined to believe that, except for those lucky few like these morons who have been predetermined to realize that there's determinism, I guess. So it's like I said, it's meaningless in and of itself, and it's useless as an argument. You can't use it to justify anything, because if you do, you run afoul of the basic reality we face, which is everybody acts as though they can be held to account for their behaviors and can avoid negative consequences, at least.
Where we know that a person isn't going to reoffend and no longer poses a threat.
Okay, so here he's saying we know,
feel the need to
even
either
when we
throw
know
that person
somebody
in prison or ruin their reputation.
Even if we know somebody's never going to reoffend, let's say they committed a crime, they became a paraplegic or a quadriplegic in the process of committing the crime, plus had a religious conversion, and we're very confident they're never going to commit another crime like that, then should we punish them at all, is the question, basically.
Do you feel that that's justified in any way? Because I certainly
Yeah, I don't. I don't think it's justified. And to give another example, if you've got one person that accidentally runs over another person, and you've got one person that deliberately murders somebody,
the long-haired guy,
two actions that are exactly the same. We recognise this even with
the long-haired guy is saying, no, it's not just to punish somebody who we know will not reoffend, because we punish people who commit an accident differently than those who commit crimes intentionally. And if somebody commits a crime by accident, then we shouldn't punish them. I mean, the clusterfuck of failure is so entangled here, I barely know where to begin pulling at. If in fact it's possible to distinguish between accident and intentional, then there's no determinism. And we don't just punish people for rehabilitative reasons, or deterrence reasons, or societal protection reasons. There are two kinds of justice, really, that we attain with the criminal justice system. One is rehabilitative, and one is, well, actually it's three kinds. One is societal, in the sense that if we're just keeping them behind bars, then they can't reoffend right now. So our goal is to rehabilitate them, make them so they won't reoffend. Our goal is to prevent them from reoffending right now by just keeping them in a cage. And our third goal is retributive justice. That is to say, to get a sense of equality for the person that's been wronged. So when my grandfather was murdered when I was in 5th grade, shot 5 times in the stomach by a store robber who didn't want him to testify against him in the store robbery trial, who was out on bail and on lunch break at the trial even, walked out of there, somehow got a gun between there and the courthouse is not that far from my grandparents' old pharmacy where it used to be, and walked there and shot him 5 times in the stomach. Now, it doesn't matter how convinced my grandmother was that this guy wouldn't reoffend, she'd still want to see him punished because it's only just that he experienced some harms to restore equilibrium given the amount of harm he caused. So whether or not you agree with retributive justice, it is a form of justice that people can use to justify punishments. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that retributive justice is appropriate. Some retribution is appropriate for somebody who's committed a heinous intentional act, regardless of their ability, likelihood, or desire to reoffend. Any thoughts on that from anybody else?
I mean, I would agree with that too. And I want to say, if you're just doing it as an act of prevention to punish somebody, why not punish one of their family members? So if you went out and committed a crime, and then I ended up, I don't know, putting your daughter or something on trial for it, and then, you know, punishing her in the middle of town for everybody to see, say, this is what happens when Eric you don't want this to happen, so don't do it, or else one of your family members will get it. Well, that would work.
Right.
As a preventative measure. That wouldn't be just, though, because your daughter didn't commit the crime. So,
right. Oh, Eric's not afraid of going to court and facing this drug charge? Well, then let's threaten to take his kid away. That way he'll give in to our plea bargain. That's the sort of awful circumstance you have when you're too utilitarian in your calculi.
Yeah. And then I would also say, in that sort of worldview, determinist worldview, how do you determine what is the essential cause versus an inessential cause?
You don't have to determine that. It's already been predetermined what you think about that. Okay, so you don't have to do anything.
Yeah. So if we want to find out if something's accidental versus determined or
intentional
or purposeful,
intentional, as long hair guy says.
How do we know? We have to find out what the essential cause is in a myriad of causes. There's an infinite amount of causes, right? The whole universe is filled with atoms colliding into one another, and you know, every other sort of action or movement that's going on in the universe that you can think of affects everything else in the universe. So how are we to determine or find out or deduce what the essential cause is versus the inessential cause in that sort of worldview?
I mean, the other thing to note there is the distinction that we make between agents and non-agents is the ability to cause effects. So, in other words, agents are distinct from rocks. That is, say, a person or a dog or a plant or something alive, or molten lava flowing, or wind, or any kind of thing that causes effects, right, is distinct from something that does not cause effects because it has the ability to cause effects. So, in other words, a rock will never rob the liquor store, but a human can. In theory, the wind could, right? The wind can have a huge gust of wind blow all the money out of the cash register and take it away. But a rock can't because it doesn't have agency. Now, if you want to deny the distinction and say, no, everything has equal agency, a rock does cause something just by persisting. That it may require agency to change, but just by persisting, it's causing things. Then you're not defining causality meaningfully. So the fact that I have to go around a rock doesn't mean the rock caused me to turn. It means my desire to be on the other side of it caused me to turn. In other words, my intentionality. In other words, my ability to choose and not have things predetermined for me. So, I mean, definitionally, you immediately run into the sort of morass that these two find themselves in when you start arguing determinism, because it doesn't make any sense. It runs afoul of everything we know and behave as though we're true. Okay, let's go to 1950. Let's go to 1950. Or 1946, close enough.
Then another.
Yeah, so it's like punishment is it's a peculiar kind of word when it comes to that, because different people mean different things by punishment, at least in my mind. But you're right, when it comes to saying that you do not have free will, you could not have chosen to do what you did, could not have chosen not to do what you did, then it does throw that into disarray, and it does make it hard to address. But you can still legitimately put arguments across as to why you should contain someone.
Yes.
So I would assume that if there's a case where somebody is absolutely going to cause destruction and mayhem,
so now he's saying,
then
let's posit a situation where we know for almost certain that somebody's going to cause a lot of destruction. Then if you know that you're going to cause a lot of destruction, then you can make a strong case for killing them, getting rid of them, and saying that it's not worth it having them. And then the other guy, Alex J. O'Connor, says, "Oh, so you're getting down to utilitarianism then?" They have no idea what utilitarianism and consequentialism actually are, because if they did, they'd understand that it's not just applicable to sort of textbook style situations like, do we do what's just or do we do what's useful? They're making all utilitarian arguments inherently by arguing determinism. They're saying that we don't have to calculate things on a justice calculus. The only real justice calculus is deontological. So I'm going to share a little wisdom with you two gentlemen here about utilitarianism and deontology.
Well, I just have something to say real quick, though.
Yeah, sure.
If it's difficult to deduce what the causes or essential causes or inessential causes are of an event of the past, how much harder would it be to deduce if somebody is likely or not to do something in the future? I mean, how do you know in a deterministic system if like given? I mean, I guess you could say in terms of like you can do some things.
They miss the observer problem.
If someone's gonna,
you can't take measurements without impacting the system. They forget that the system's an open system in that capacity. So an observer cannot observe and take measurements without impacting the system, which is why no matter how many data points, even if you had infinitely many, and you couldn't predict the weather for more than a couple weeks out. Why? Because it's a chaotic system that has randomness built into it. So,
I mean, I guess my point is, given any data set, you have to find out what the essential elements of that data set are and ignore other parts of it. You need to push things into the shadow in order to bring things into light. And so if I'm going to try to find out if somebody will do something in the future, I need to find out what is essential to be looked at, and then remove and put into the shadow other things.
Right.
And that's true with anything. If I'm going to study fungus, I need to only study things pertaining to fungus and not be looking at celestial bodies and determining their movement.
I think they'd argue, though, that everything is a web of so many causes and of such complexity that we will never be able to actually, that it's a meaningless question to even ask which one is determinant, because it's an inevitable consequence of everything that came before. But the problem with that argument, of course, is that it's not meaningful. They're not defining causality as anything, and there's no meaning we can take away from that to use, because after all, we can't do anything willfully. We can only just be as we have been predetermined to be. So, why are you making
There's
those
no
YouTube
use in asking the question.
Yeah,
why are you asking the question?
You're not doing any good at making those YouTube videos, that's for sure, because everyone's either predetermined to become an atheist like you, or predetermined to remain a stupid religious person who is responsible for all the world's problems.
I mean, in a justice system, if we're trying to say if we should punish somebody or not, or if we're trying to find out if somebody will commit a murder in the future again or not, like, why even ask that question?
Right, because if we determine the answer yes or no, we can't do anything about it. If we could determine what's predetermined, in other words, let's say they would be willing to acknowledge that you could get enough of a handle on causality to have a better or worse chance of correctly predicting something. For example, if I know there are 4 aces and 1 king left in the deck and nothing else, there's 5 cards in the deck and there's only 4 aces and 1 king, and I say, well, I think I'm going to pull an ace, I've got a better chance of being right than if I say I think I'm going to pull a king, assuming they're randomly shuffled, you know? Now, the thing is, we can check that, we can test that, and we realize that people can, in fact, more accurately predict some things than others. So, is it because they've determined the most likely cause of the thing? And if so, what are the limits there? If we can determine cause, does that mean that we can base our assumption going forward that the same causal effect relationship will occur again and again and again? Because that's not the case. So what's the purpose of this? Does it have any teleology behind it? Without any purpose, it's just a meaningless bunch of drivel that is additionally never useful in making any kind of argument. Because after all, whatever kind of argument you're making is either suggesting we do something or not do something, or believe something or don't believe something, or think this way is correct or think that way is correct. But there's no right or wrong or true or false or anything like that if everything's predetermined. Because those things require one to be able to make choices, to say, I'm going to act this way because this is true. Things don't have statuses like true and false except as they link to purpose. Only observers make those status observations.
Yeah, and there's no difference between me observing something or doing something or saying something and you doing it.
Yes, there is.
There's no difference. Well, I mean, not in a deterministic system besides the atoms, but like I'm saying the source is all determined. It's like a not a hive mind, but kind of. It's like each individual entity isn't really an individual entity, it's just acting.
Okay, well, I didn't realize at first you were describing their position. I thought you were actually stating your own position.
No, yeah, I was just describing theirs.
Okay, yeah.
It's like there's no individual agency in that sort of thought.
Definitionally, that's what's missing, right? Is agency. Now, what they'd say is, no, we can see that there are agents without intentionality, like the wind and flowing water, therefore agency does not require intentionality. But the fact that you can make the distinction means that there's some difference between the way that water affects flowing water affects change and the way that people affect change. If you just say, well, that's an illusion or something, I mean, but, you know, it's like, if I say that there's a distinction between agents and non-agents, and you say, well, it doesn't require intentionality, then I'd say, okay, but can we distinguish between intentional and non-intentional agents? And you'd say either no, lie, and say, no, we can't make that distinction, there's no such distinction. Or say, yes, such a distinction exists, but in some way doesn't count to meaningfully ascribe any status to... Is that you, Katie Anderson? Yes. We can't meaningfully ascribe any distinction, the distinction any meaning, right? You can't... It's just so strange. Because obviously we draw the distinction between something that's living and willful that causes an impact, and something that's non-living and non-willful that causes an impact. Now, if there's actually distinction, then free will exists. If there's not actually distinction, then what are we distinguishing between there? And if you say just an illusion, well, how do we know it's just an illusion, and what makes that illusion different from reality? Because you can't get outside the box to check if you're a determinist at all. So I'm not sure what that would mean, so to speak, you know? Any other thoughts on this stuff before we draw this video to a close?
I feel like there's something that I wanted you to see that I'm missing, but I guess.
Well, let's go forward a bit and see. I'll push it. I'm at 31:19 now, and let's see what it says.
The idea that all things are determined is false.
Yes.
But people would then think, as they've said, oh, there are...
Let's see here. Hold on. 3042. I'm going back
This
to.
book, I was somewhat on the fence. And the reason I was on the fence was because I hadn't fully looked into it. But
wait.
thought in my head,
Go
what
to
about quantum physics?
2440.
You see where I'm going with this, in the sense that there's the point to be made that a lot of people...
Wait, well, hold on. Let me see what he's saying.
Does that not leave some... because I hadn't fully looked into it, but I thought in my head, what about...
The short-haired guy says, what about quantum physics?
You see where I'm going with this, in the sense that there's the point to be made that a lot of people think that true randomness exists in the quantum realm. And if true randomness can exist, that means everything isn't determined.
Mm-hmm.
And so does that not leave some leeway for free will? And obviously, I think
Yeah,
we agree
so-
on this. But
Yeah,
how would
no,
how would you respond to
I
that?
think it does two things that are very important. First of all, you could legitimately say that determinism is false. The idea that all things are determined is false.
Yes.
But people would then think, as they've said, oh, there are quantum fluctuations, or however they want to call it. Then
Okay, so what he just said, for those in the room who can't hear it, the thing about quantum mechanics is you could say that quantum mechanics proves that determinism is false, because after all, not everything is entirely predetermined. There is some quantum fluctuations, or whatever you want to call it. However, the problem is that what people do then, and they have done it, is they assume it applies at the macro level. That because blah, 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 there must be free will at the macro level. But that's simply not the case. I think is where he's going at the last bit of it here.
therefore free will exists.
Like
That's the problem.
Michio Kaku.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect example. So, but that's the problem. It's
Okay, so just because there's randomness at the quantum level doesn't mean free will exists. Okay, I agree. But the problem is, you're affirming, really. You're not negating. The status quo is everybody acts as though and assumes that they have some intentionality, that they can choose something or choose against something. I know that I'm freest in my will when I'm least emotional. Emotions muddy the liberty that I have. If I'm really angry, I'm compelled to pursue one course, and I'm not really able to make choices sometimes. If I'm really sad, I'm compelled to pursue one course and not really able to make choices. So I think free will may be an emergent function of a healthy agency, possibly, or it's on a spectrum, right? Like, not all acts are equally free. That's the other problem you have if you're a determinist, is we all know from our own experience, not all acts are equally free. It feels different, it seems different when I'm forced to do something than when I choose to do something. They seem different to me. You might say, well, you choose to do the thing you're forced because you're trying to avoid the consequence. So really, it's the consequences causing you. Your knowledge of the consequences causing you to do the thing. Okay, but nevertheless, I draw a distinction between that which is chosen freely because I want it and that which is chosen unfreely because I'm trying to avoid a consequence. So is that just an illusory feeling? And does that mean, if so, that forcing people to do things is the same as asking them to do things? Or does it not matter because it's all predetermined anyway? Now, the thing is, what they did there is they shifted burdens, right? So they start off arguing in favor of determinism. But then in that case, he shifts and he's like, now the problem with this is that then people conclude that free will must exist because quantum mechanics. And that's simply not the case. Well, but remember, free will in this instance is negating determinism. That's how the video started. You guys were you guys were affirming determinism, not negating free will. Now, you might think those are the same things, but that's part of your knowledge gap. The affirmation has the burden to affirm. The negation has a little bit of an easier job. I'll take either side, but you have to decide which side you're on. You can't just toss your burdens over here, because there are advantages to affirming too. If you're affirming, you get to make your case and other people have to respond to it. You can anticipate how they're going to respond and prep out little traps and spikes and all kinds of shit, So it does matter what you're doing here. Now, if you're saying free will needs to affirm in order for anyone to believe it, because as a default, we ought to disbelieve things that make extraordinary claims. Fine, but this problem is free will doesn't make any extraordinary claims. It says people ought to be held accountable for their actions if they're intentional. It draws a distinction between intentionality and accidentality. So it really ought to be the default. There's no reason to conclude that we don't have what appears to be so. You have to provide reasons why we don't have what appears to be so. And you can provide good reasons, good enough to say, because everything emerges from a field of causes, everything's an effect. But for the same argument you just used about quantum mechanics and free will can be used about that. Just because just because it might be true that everything emerges from a field of causes doesn't make everything an effect. So, you failed to establish that. It is possible to frame just about anything as an effect, right? So I could say, well, if I frame it through a position where the movement of particles and the movement of waves through media, namely physical reality, produces physical impacts, therefore physical reality produces all impacts, which is what you're saying, therefore any attempt to position some impacts as metaphysical in nature, in other words, changing meanings, not changing states of matter, that changing meanings either is irrelevant, illusory, or an effect of changing physicalities. But that's not the case, right? I mean, somebody jump in here. I'm floundering away because I'm just so flabbergasted at the idiocy.
I think at least part of what you were saying is, like, simply put, that a lot of people misunderstand what the law of causality even says. They think it says everything has a cause, when it's just every effect has a cause. So, I mean, you're right in saying that, just because things come from these these emergent causes, or everything emerges from these causes, that's not necessarily the case. There could be things that are just there without cause, and that's entirely possible. It's not illogical, at least.
Well, I mean, the other thing is it makes everything an effect. So if everything is anything, then the word is meaningless. If I say every direction's up, then the word direction doesn't mean anything, and up doesn't mean anything.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's well put.
Okay, let's end the video there then. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese. You too, guys. I'm sure you're very, very nice people. I don't mean to be abusive towards you.
Oh, hold on. I did want you to look at 2450.
2450. Here we come. 2439. 2448.
Absolutely have to get everybody on the same plane. We have to convince everybody of the premise of this book. We have to put it into the school curriculum. We have to make everybody understand the philosophical grounding for the practical implications. If people aren't in agreement that free will doesn't exist, then any practical implications that we can come up with, if I say, okay, free will doesn't exist, therefore we need to stop holding people morally accountable. If you don't think free will doesn't exist, then there's nothing we can do about that, because
it seems
we
to
couldn't
be that needs to be the starting
so
point.
we have to absolutely. So for me, people often ask, this is the first thing people ask, they say, what are the practical implications? For me, that's not the most important thing at the moment. The most important thing now is to convince people of the premise. Then it's only fair that we do that.
Why is it important? So, okay, what he just said there is the most important thing is to convince people that determinism is real, so that then we can move forward about practical implications. It doesn't really matter. The most important thing is to convince everybody that, yes, determinism, that no, free will doesn't exist. Why is it important?
Yeah, I mean, they still hold to the idea that truth is good and seeking truth is good. I mean, they misunderstand what the truth is, but they still agree that the truth itself, whatever that may be, is good to seek after. But they have no justification as to why.
How can you seek if there's determinism?
Right, yeah. It's not you. It's like there's no you and there's no seekage, right?
So perhaps a better way for you guys to understand this is as that intentionality and human being through time are the same thing. In other words, you're either intentionality on some level, either in varying degrees of freedom, I would say, and depending on how much of it is reflexive. You guys are, doing intellectual growth at the moment, and that's a good thing, and you should be happy about yourselves with that. But I would recommend talking to me, frankly. I'd recommend asking me some questions. I don't mean you any ill will, and I apologize for my sometimes abusive tone. It's a bad habit I need to break myself of. Anyhow, you guys are smart guys, and I don't doubt that as you age and grow, and if you choose to take on the challenging intellectual paths. I mean, the thing is, it's very easy to avoid talking to me and just be smug in your wrongness. Talking to me is going to be scary for you because, I mean, if we end up debating, quote unquote, I'll make mincemeat pie out of you. It won't even be a remote. It's like I debate better than that people all the time. So you guys are in trouble with that. But if you come and you ask questions and want to learn things, you know, the whole universe changes for you. This is a question of, do you want to apply free will or habit? Because free will says, if you're so sure that the most important thing is that you convince everybody of the thesis of that book, convince me. If you can convince me of it, you'll have a powerful advocate on your team. And I promise to be convinced by the most rational explanations. I'm not going to embrace some lie because I'm attached to it. If in fact there's something I haven't considered, and in fact determinism makes perfect sense, and I need to listen to what you're saying, then I will concede that that's the case, and I will embrace your argumentation because I want to always have the best arguments possible available to myself. I don't want to make bad arguments again and again and again. If in fact you've got better arguments than mine, I will take them on as my own and say, you are right, I concede. So if in fact you're serious about it being important to believe in the thesis of that book, to disseminate the thesis of the book, to make others, to convert people to it, basically, I'm an open convert. What do they call that? Perspective convert. I'm an open-minded perspective convert. Come convince me.
Can I give the outro?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, folks, for watching, and make sure you freely choose to eat plenty of cheese.
Well said.